Gentlemen, there's a pattern that shows up so often it might as well be a season. Same setup, same turning points, same ending. A man is in a relationship that works. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's functional. There's respect, there's history, there's a life being built. Then, almost quietly, he starts noticing someone else. Not like a movie, no lightning bolt, no dramatic soundtrack, just a small shift of attention, a second longer looking, a little more curiosity, a little more what if than he's willing to admit. At first, he calls it nothing. He tells himself it's harmless. He tells himself he's only human. He tells himself he's not doing anything. And because nothing explodes immediately, he assumes nothing is happening. Then, months later, maybe a year or two, he's sitting alone in a different place with different furniture and a different routine, flipping through old photos like they belong to someone else. That's when the question lands with real, wait, how did just noticing turn into the demolition of a life I actually valued? That question is a particular kind of regret. The kind that doesn't come from a single bad decision, but from a chain of small permissions you never labeled as dangerous. And it begins with something most men misunderstand. Not a decision, not a plan, but a feeling you don't name early enough to control. The comfort paradox. The first ingredient is familiarity. In any long relationship, you stop being surprised. You learn your partner's patterns. You know the timing of her moods. You know the story behind the scar. You know how she drinks her coffee and what she does when she's stressed. You can predict the week based on the tone of her hello. That familiarity is not a flaw. It's the point. It's the foundation of trust, the evidence of real intimacy. The reason you can be your full self, tired, unshaven, imperfect, without having to audition for love every day. But familiarity has a cost that modern life doesn't prepare you to handle. Your brain adapts. Human attention is wired for novelty. Your nervous system treats new as important because, evolutionarily, new could mean opportunity or threat. The brain is designed to stop firing the alarm once something becomes stable, not because it's worthless, but because it's predictable. Predictable doesn't require as much energy. So the dopamine spike you used to get from her smile, her laugh, the way she looked at you across a room. Over time, your brain files it under known. You still care. You still value it, but the chemistry is quieter. Here's where men get fooled. You mistake the quieting of novelty for the disappearance of love. You think, if this were right, it would feel like it did at the beginning. You interpret the normal settling of a bond as proof you're losing something. You forget that early passion is ignition, not fuel. It's a spark, not a steady burn. And if you're not careful, you start comparing the sustainable heat of a long fire to the flash of a match. That's not romance advice. That's simply how brains work. The other person problem. Then, into that vulnerable mental space, another person enters, usually not a stranger. More often, someone close enough to be real, but far enough to stay untested. A colleague, someone in a friend group, a person you see at the gym, an acquaintance who appears just frequently enough to become a recurring thought. And this matters. You don't meet the full version of that person. You see the polished cut, the public edition, the version that shows up on time, smiles, holds eye contact, has good stories, looks put together. You see them in controlled environments where everyone is performing a little. You don't see them sick, bitter, insecure, or boring. You don't see them on a random Tuesday when their nervous system is fried and they take it out on the nearest person. You don't see what they're like when the rent is due, the car needs repairs, and they're not getting their way. You see the highlight reel, and your brain fills in the rest with fantasy. A man can build an entire relationship in his head out of 4 conversations and a few glances. It's not because he's stupid, it's because the mind hates incomplete stories. When data is missing, imagination steps in and calls itself truth. Suddenly, the other person becomes a symbol, not of who they are, but of what you feel you're missing. Excitement, admiration, ease, being seen as impressive again. And here's the trap: fantasy feels like insight. It feels like I'm finally waking up. It feels like this is what I was meant to feel. It feels like clarity. But what it really is, most of the time, is projection on an unpainted wall. How the mind builds a case against your partner. Once the fantasy has momentum, your mind does something even more dangerous. It starts building justification. Men like to think they're rational, but we're rational after the fact. The heart moves, and the mind becomes the lawyer. The mind doesn't ask, is this wise? It asks, how do I defend this so I can live with myself? So you start auditing your relationship like a prosecutor. The small things that never mattered suddenly become evidence. The habit you used to laugh at becomes an irritation. A difference in communication style becomes we're incompatible. The normal compromises of adult life become I'm losing myself. You start telling yourself stories that sound mature on the surface. We've grown apart. I'm not happy. I need to be true to myself. Something is missing. I deserve passion. Those sentences feel like self-respect. They feel like honesty, but often they're a cover for something simpler and less noble. Your brain is chasing novelty and calling it destiny. Here's a hard truth. You can be sincerely convinced and still be wrong. You can genuinely feel like you're seeing clearly when what's happening is your mind has already decided what it wants, and now it's rearranging the evidence to match the verdict. That's not evil. That's human. But if you don't recognize it, it will steer you right off a cliff with a sense of confidence. The lines you cross before you cross a line. Most men don't jump directly into physical cheating. The slide is usually psychological first. You start creating opportunities. You linger longer. You respond faster. You find yourself hoping they'll text. You replay conversations. You start dressing a little sharper on days you might see them, like your body knows what your mouth won't admit. Then comes the most common accelerant: emotional outsourcing. You start telling this person about your relationship issues, not in a crude way, in a I'm just being honest way. You confide in them. They listen. They validate. The bond grows. And it feels innocent because you're not touching. You're not doing anything. But you are. Because intimacy isn't only physical. Intimacy is the allocation of attention, vulnerability, and emotional energy. It's who gets your real thoughts, who gets your effort, who you prioritize. Once you start feeding a second bond while starving the first, the end is already in motion. You've created a parallel lane in your life that will eventually demand a choice. And at this stage, something else happens. The new connection feels effortless. Of course it does. There are no shared bills yet, no chores, no routines, no tired mornings, no repeated arguments, no logistical friction. It's all possibility and adrenaline. It's all upside because nothing has been tested. You're comparing the messy reality of a long relationship to the clean fantasy of a new one. That's not a fair fight. Why? The new thing feels like you again. Men often describe this phase as feeling alive, like they've found themselves, like the world has color again. But listen carefully. Aliveness isn't proof of compatibility. Aliveness is what your nervous system does when there's uncertainty, risk, novelty, and reward. It's the same reason gambling feels exciting. It's the same reason starting a new job can feel like reinvention. It's the same reason a late night conversation with a stranger can feel profound. The feeling is real. The conclusion is often false. You are not necessarily more alive because the person is better. You are more alive because the situation is unstable and your brain is paying attention. And if you don't understand that, you will chase alive the way some men chase horsepower, always wanting more, never satisfied, always upgrading, always convinced the next engine will finally fix the emptiness. The break, the rush, the vindication. Then comes the collapse. Maybe you leave, maybe you cheat, maybe you become distant, enough that the relationship dies slowly under the weight of your withdrawal. However it happens, a line gets crossed and the old life breaks. If you move into the new thing, the first months can feel like proof you were right. The chemistry is strong. The sex is intense. The conversations feel fresh. You tell yourself this is what love is supposed to feel like. You might even look back at your previous relationship and feel a cold kind of superiority. I was settling. I was asleep. Now I'm awake. That's a dangerous story to tell yourself because it protects you from the one thing that might save you later: accountability. Reality shows up like it always does then. Real life arrives quietly, inevitably. The new person becomes an actual full human being, not a symbol, not a fantasy, not a curated experience. You start seeing the stuff you never saw before: their stress patterns, their insecurities, their moods, their coping habits, their flaws, their family dynamics, their blind spots. They leave messes. They get annoyed. They have days when they're not inspiring. They have a tone sometimes that grates. They disappoint you. They are inconsistent in ways that don't show up in the highlight reel. And here's the part that should terrify you if you're paying attention. You begin to habituate again. Their laugh becomes familiar. Their face becomes normal. Your brain stops firing fireworks. You start feeling that same quiet dullness you thought was evidence that your previous relationship was wrong. The pattern repeats because the mechanism was never the partner. It was the misunderstanding of what novelty means, the shape of regret. Regret rarely hits like a punch. It's usually slow. It's fog in the valley. It's a weight that grows. You start thinking about the previous relationship differently, not because it was perfect, but because distance changes perspective. The flaws you obsessed over now look like ordinary friction, two adults, with different wiring, trying to build a shared life. The routines you called boring now look like stability. The predictability you resented now looks like safety. You start to understand what you traded away, that you can't easily replace. Someone who knew your history without you having to explain it. Inside jokes built over years. A shared language trust that survived hard seasons, being known deeply, not just admired superficially. You had a person who understood your patterns, your stress signals, your family, your ambition, your fears, the parts of you that aren't impressive but are real. And you swapped that for a chemical high you mistook for fate. That's when the regret gets specific. Not I miss her, but I didn't understand what I had. The lesson most men learn too late. Here's what becomes obvious only after the damage. Relationships are not found. They are built. Compatibility is not a lightning strike, it's a discipline. It's two people learning how to communicate under stress. It's repair after conflict. It's the willingness to stay curious about a person you think you already know. It's creating new experiences instead of demanding that life always feel new on its own. Most men were not trained for that. Many of us grew up on stories that teach the wrong metric. We were sold the idea that love means effortless excitement forever, that the right woman will keep you feeling the way you felt in the first 3 months, that if you have to work at it, something's wrong. That story is poison because everything meaningful requires maintenance. Your body, your finances, your strength, your skill, your career, your mind. Why would a relationship, something that involves two nervous systems, two histories, two sets of needs, and the constant pressure of life, be the one thing that runs on autopilot forever? It won't. If you expect it to, you'll eventually interpret normal reality as failure and run toward the next fantasy. But what if something really is missing? Now, let's be clear. This is not an argument for staying in unhealthy relationships. If there is abuse, manipulation, contempt, repeated betrayal, addiction with no effort to change, consistent disrespect, those are not stale seasons. Those are real problems. Some relationships should end, but that's not what most men are dealing with when this pattern starts. Most men are dealing with a basically solid relationship that has entered a normal phase. Less fireworks, more routine. Less thrill, more partnership. Less mystery, more truth. And instead of understanding that as maturity, they interpret it as death. Then they meet someone new and mistake the return of adrenaline for the return of meaning. The real alternative. The real alternative isn't moralizing. It's strategy. If you are in a fundamentally healthy relationship and you're feeling pulled towards someone else, the question isn't, am I a bad person? The question is, what system in me is being hijacked right now? Because attraction to novelty is not a character flaw. It's a human default. If you don't manage it deliberately, it will manage you. So what does management look like? It looks like refusing to feed the fantasy. Fantasy is fueled by access and attention. It grows when you water it. It dies when you cut off the supply. It looks like not creating private intimacy with the other person, not confiding in them about your relationship, not seeking them out for emotional validation, not using them as an escape hatch. It looks like being honest with yourself first. Most men don't want to admit it, but the other person is often less about them and more about you wanting to feel powerful again, wanted again, interesting again, seen again. That's not shameful. It's human. But it becomes destructive when you use another person to solve an internal hunger you never learned to address directly. And the deeper move, the move that separates boys from men, is reinvestment. Not in a fake way, not by forcing romance like a performance, but by understanding a serious truth. You can create novelty inside commitment. You can change routines. You can pursue goals together. You can build projects. You can travel. You can evolve the relationship. You can learn new ways to communicate. You can bring back tension and play and challenge. But none of that happens passively. It happens because you decide your relationship is not something you consume. It's something you build. Why this matters specifically for men. Men have a particular vulnerability here. We confuse feeling with truth, then defend it with logic. We are also taught, quietly, culturally, that newness equals status. A new partner can feel like an upgrade, like proof you still have it, like winning, but if you're not careful, you'll chase that feeling the way some men chase money without meaning, always wanting the next. Hit, never satisfied, always building a life that looks impressive and feels empty. Real masculinity isn't the ability to attract novelty. Real masculinity is the ability to commit with eyes open and continue choosing your values when your impulses offer you a faster reward. Discipline is more masculine than temptation. Consistency is more masculine than attention. Repair is more masculine than escape. A final test: before you trade a real relationship for a possible one, run one test, not a romantic test, a reality test. Ask yourself, do I want a series of beginnings or do I want depth? Because beginnings are easy to find. There will always be someone new who laughs at your stories, someone who hasn't heard your flaws yet, someone who makes you feel electric because you haven't had to discuss real life with them. Depth is rare. Depth is earned. Depth requires staying long enough for novelty to fade, and then choosing to build anyway. If your partner knows your routines, your stress tells, your family history, your ambitions, your insecurities, the way you take your coffee when you're barely holding it together, if she has stood with you through the boring parts and the hard parts and kept choosing you, understand what that is. That is not the absence of passion. That is the presence of loyalty and investment, the raw materials of a life. And if you're about to blow that up because someone new makes you feel alive in conversation, someone you've never had to coordinate life with, argue with, compromise with, rebuild with, then be honest about what you're choosing. You're not necessarily choosing authenticity over settling. You may be choosing the illusion of novelty over the reality of depth. And unless you learn this lesson at the level of behavior, not just understanding, but action, you won't escape the cycle. You'll repeat it with the next person and the next, always shocked when the magic fades, never realizing the magic was never meant to last as a feeling. The point was always what comes after. The question isn't whether you can feel sparks with someone new. The question is whether you have the discipline to keep a fire going when it stops entertaining you and starts asking something of you. Because the men who win long term are not the men who never feel tempted. They're the men who recognize temptation as information, not instruction, and who build a life they don't have to escape.